My name is Feems, and I'm going to be talking about navigating Web3 grants from application review to decision making. And so hopefully the purpose of this workshop is for you to really be prepared when you're applying for a grant and see what are the things that you actually need to do to be successful in it. I would like to also say that grants in general should actually be a supplementary, so an addition to your current funding. It shouldn't be really your only source of funding. And so a little bit about myself. I am a grant program reviewer, as well as I study grant programs and funding mechanisms on chain. And I've been in the space about 4 years, and some of the organizations that I've actually worked with are Gitcoin, Pocket, Arbitrum, and many others. Sorry, I'm a little bit forgetful today. So here again is the workshop goal. So we'll do an overview of the Web3 grants and their players, understand the grant process, as well as tips for successful applications. And I was gonna do a workshop exercise, but in talking to everybody, I think it'd be much more valuable to do a question and answer period. And if English isn't your first language, I do have my lovely friend Almond who would be able to translate on my behalf. So let's get started. So Web3 grants are basically funds that support projects on the blockchain to innovate or improve their ecosystems. They are supplementary and used as a mode to increase growth within an ecosystem, awareness, or adoption into the crypto space. And there are 3 types of grant operators. And so a grant operator is basically somebody that manages grant programs. And so there are 3 ways that you can go and get grants, and these are the types of people who manage these types of grants. So the first ones are foundation grants. So an example could be the Optimism Foundation or the Arbitrum Foundations, and these are usually centralized entities who represent the DAO in a formal way, but do also have their own form of grants. These types of grants are a little bit more serious, and the review process is a little bit harder than maybe some optional grants like from the DAO or through a direct donor like Gitcoin. Now, majority of the grants are actually funded with about 4 different types of streams. So one of them is developer grants. And so this would be something to create like new software, applications, infrastructure. These are mostly suited for those with a technical background that are looking at building a product within an ecosystem. And so in terms of development grants, the application process, you'd also have to start showing your proof of work or your MVP, and sometimes as well your history using GitHub. The second ones are community grants, and these represent like grants such as like ETH Mexico, for example, in which that you want to grow your awareness. And so a community grant would be something that you would apply for that would increase the adoption within that particular ecosystem, support the ecosystem, or provide awareness within the ecosystem. And some examples could be events, as I mentioned. The 4th kind of category is research grants. And so I'm a recipient of many research grants. And so that basically supports research that will support the objective of the ecosystem that you're applying for. So an example would be if you were doing research on governance mechanisms, you could apply for a grant within governance mechanisms within particular programs that have a goal within the area of governance. And then the last one is infrastructure grants. And so those are a little bit more technical, and they're mostly focused on the developing applications on the blockchain layer. So infrastructure grants, you can get them much larger, but then again, you'd actually have to show your proof of work much more diligently in order for those to get accepted. Okay, and so there are 5 common goals when applying for a grant in most grant programs. And so I've just like showcased different types of them. So as I mentioned before is ecosystem growth. And so ecosystem growth, you'll notice in grant programs could mean different things. It could mean a growth in users, it could mean a growth in TVL, it could mean many, many things. And so it's really important when you're looking at a particular grant that might have things like ecosystem, awareness, community, to really look at like what the goal of that particular grant is, because everyone might be different. So they're not all the same. So if it's a ecosystem growth grant, it might not be the same as from one ecosystem to the other ecosystem. So that's really important. The third is about awareness and adoption. And that can happen in many different ways. So you can have an application, like a developer application that you're planning to build and apply for a grant in regards to that. You can throw an event. So awareness and adoption is really awareness within the community that you're applying for. How do you increase the awareness of that, as well as like what is the adoption that people can do in order to to increase the usage of that community. So an example of an adoption would be like you're throwing an event like ETH Mexico, you get a grant from a particular foundation or an ecosystem, and you say, hey, I'm throwing this event, and we would like to showcase some of the things that are happening within your ecosystem. And so that could be an example of an adoption and awareness as well. The third is protocol development. And so a protocol like Arbitrum or an Optimism, for example, needs developers to make their protocol better, really. So whether it's like security risks or infrastructure or things like this. And then the same could be like tooling and infrastructure, as well as community initiatives and governance. Okay, sorry, that was done. So when you're applying for a grant, there's a process that remains the same, independent of what type of grant you're applying for. So first you go on the page, you read about the grant, you see what their goals are, and then you decide to apply. So first there'll be an application period, and this whole period between 1 to 5 is usually indicated within the grant program page. So you know when the deadlines are happening, and you know when to receive the information that you're expecting, whether you're approved or you're not approved. And sometimes the approval is actually public on platforms like Charmverse. So you would actually be able to see which projects within that grant program have been approved or denied, so that you can get a better idea in the event that your application isn't successful. The second is a review period. And a review period is usually done by a grant program team or a team of reviewers. The great thing about Web3 is that a lot of the reviews are actually public in this form of a rubric. And a rubric is basically like a table that they would list their specific goals, like how is it possible, I'm just using different words for simplicity, feasibility, which basically means like, is there a possibility that these people can actually develop what they said they're gonna develop? Does this meet the specific goals? And then it's usually a rate from 1 to 5. So if you wanna really know how you're going to be assessed, the first thing that I would do before also applying, after reading the program descriptions and the objectives, is really to read the rubric. So because the rubric is going to be the deciding document for people to decide whether or not you receive your grant, in most cases. And then the decisions are made. In terms of DAOs, they're usually publicly announced. So when a grant program has closed or have provided all of the money that they have, they usually post it in the forum about who actually received those grants, or sometimes you'll like hear it on social media or on X. In most cases, they also do use a platform like Charmverse or Questbook, where you'll actually get to see already who's already been approved in those particular grants. And then the fourth one is the funds are distributed. So the requirement really, if you're applying for a grant, is really to have a crypto wallet, because that's how the money or the funds are being distributed, usually within like crypto tokens. And then with that, some of them, depending on the ecosystem, you might have to KYC, which is know your customer, which is provide your information as well. So if you are wanting to stay anonymous, it's very, very important to understand before you're applying for a grant, what are the requirements in order for you to receive funds. And then the fifth one, which is, I would say, quite new in the last year or so, is that a lot of grants have really been strict about measuring impact. And so impact is basically like, if you're looking at grants as an investment, the grant operator is your investor. And so they want to know whether or not the funds that they gave you is actually valuable to that ecosystem or meets the goals that you did say. So with project tracking, what usually happens, and it can happen in different platforms, some would require you to provide bi-weekly updates within the DAO and the forum to say what you've actually done so far. Others use tools like Karma Gap. And with Karma Gap, you can basically add your project onto the platform and then attest, confirm all of your milestones and then mint it on-chain. And so there it will actually provide you an on-chain reputation as well, because what it does is it tracks different types of grants that you've received within different types of ecosystem. So if you're a reviewer, then you can actually go on the platform and search that project and see whether or not they've received any funds to avoid paying them for something that's already been done in another ecosystem. Okay, so I do a lot of reviews for grants, and I found that there are common things that people can do to actually be more successful in terms of their grants, or just learn from where their gaps are if they're not successful in receiving any funds. So the first one is to research past grantees. So as I mentioned before, with some DAOs particularly, or with direct donations like Gitcoin, for example, you have the opportunity to see who's received funding. And so the best thing for you to do really is to research what's already out there, what has been funded, and how they position themselves to become valuable to that ecosystem in order to receive that grant. Now, like I said before, is that the grant shouldn't be the first step. You should be thinking about, how do I develop a product that people actually want to eventually pay for? And so I know that sounds maybe Web 2, but in reality, this is actually how it works, because as I mentioned before, if the grant operators are your investors, they're going to eventually look for a return of investment. But because of your reputation being on-chain, if you say get a grant and you don't do the job, your reputation could be really, really impacted. So it's just best to think of something that you think that people would want, and then go from there, and then find the ecosystem that best suits your future. Because what I've also recognized too is that when people are applying for grants, they really do think on the short term, and then they'll move from one ecosystem to the other ecosystem and the other and to another. And the problem is that if you do not have enough support, your project isn't really going to maintain sustainability, and then you're also could impact your reputation by being seen as a grant hunter. Because people, again, want to know that they're receiving a return of their investment. So it's really, really important to research past grantees. Also, an opportunity to, when you're researching past grantees, is that, let's say that your project doesn't work out, but you want to continue building, there could be an opportunity for you to reach out to specific projects that align with your skill sets and your goals as well, and so just build better products. The second one is that it's very, very important to actually read the program description, objective, and rubric. What I found mostly is that when people were applying for grants is that they had their project in mind, but they didn't really know why they were applying for a grant for that ecosystem. Again, it was revenue driven. And that's the thing with that, if you just think oh, I just want to get money here and that's it, you're actually not going to build a sustainable product, and then it's going to distract you from actually building something that people want. And then the third one is really understand the eligibility and criteria. So this is actually really, really important, because this is a factor that plays into the assessment of the grant. So even if, I'm not saying don't try, you can try, but again, these are tips to be more successful in your application process. So it's really important to understand the eligibility and criteria. And sometimes the eligibility is that your product might have to already be on that particular chain that you're applying for. So, and that's what people want to see. They might want to see more traction. They might want to see more, you've already received a grant. So they need some history and some feasibility. And so that also plays into the eligibility and criteria. So whether or not you're a good candidate. And then the fourth is set clear, specific, and tractable objectives. What I've recognized a lot too with grants is that, people's KPIs are great, but the connection of what value it actually brings to that ecosystem is not really clear. And then how people are thinking about, I just want to build, but the thing is that like, how are you going to really determine growth? Because you might be successful in your first grant, but with a lot of overhead for many, many projects, you're most likely going to apply for another grant. And so when you apply for another grant, you're going to have to show them what you've already done and what you've achieved. And if you're already on a platform like Karma Gap, for example, the reviewers will be able to see that you've received a grant and look at your milestones and see whether or not you've actually achieved those milestones. So it's really important already when you're planning a project to have clear goals and specific and tractable objectives. And of course, as I mentioned before, you need to create a digital wallet. So if you don't have one now, it's really, really important too, because the funds are distributed via tokens. Okay. Where's my slide? Okay, well, sorry. So there's 2 slides actually missing. But what I really wanted to talk about is that where do you find grants in general? And so of course you can go to DAOs, but there are 2 great platforms that provide you an opportunity to search a bunch of grants. And so one of them is Questbook. And so I'll send this over to East Mexico with all of the resources so that eventually you can like read it and get it, because I'm just saying it right now. But so the first one is Questbook. And with Questbook, the great thing about it is that it manages many grants for many ecosystems. And there are currently ones that are open. There are at least 4 that are open currently from Arbitrum DAO. So Questbook manages it. And the great thing about that platform as well is like when you click on it, on the grant program, you get to know all of the information about it, what is the criteria, the eligibility, but also who has been accepted, who is a successful grantee. And so that way it provides you an opportunity to understand what it takes really to be a successful candidate. And then the second one is that Karma Gap. As I mentioned before, Karma Gap does do tracking and milestones, but they've also just released a Web3 grant registry. And so there you'd actually see much more that they don't manage. So it's just an array of different types of grants and grants programs that are listed. And then from there, you can click and go on the pages of those respective pages and learn about what they require in order for you to receive this grant. And then the final one that I really wanted to talk about was Gitcoin. So Gitcoin is a platform that allows projects to raise funds in this thing called a round. And a round is basically like a curated fundraise that will have different types of projects. So again, you still have to apply for the round, so please keep in mind my suggestions. But the great thing about Gitcoin is that a lot of these rounds have matching. And so matching is basically like, if I was an organization and I really believed in open source software, I want to donate $100,000. And so $100,000 is a matching pool. And so dependent on how much people have donated to these different projects, they will receive a certain amount of the matching pool. And so that's also a really great way for you to fundraise for early stage projects, because it's not going through a heavy assessment and eligibility criteria, but the success of your Gitcoin raise or fundraise in general is based on how well you can market yourself and how well you can grow your own community. So that I would say is more like the Web3 version of Kickstarter with quadratic funding. And so I wanted to finish my last 10 minutes or so, instead of us doing an exercise, if anybody had any questions in terms of grants, and then if it's in Spanish, just like please let me know, and then Amin can translate for me. So yes. Do we need a microphone?
Thanks. Thank you for this amazing information. I have a question. What is your recommendation for if I manage a grant program to provide the tokens from the grantee? It's my question is, what do you think about the do only two pays in at the first of the grant and the last of the grant when they finish this thing, or what do you think about the superfluid thing to manage the tokens to the grantee?
If I'm understanding you correctly, that's fine. I just showed. No, no, no. If I can understand
For the streaming.
Huh?
For the recording.
Oh, okay. Sorry. If I can understand you correctly, you're asking, you run a grant program and you are giving money to grantees. And so then the question is that should you give the money all at once or in the middle? So the question is really like how to distribute funds to grantees, but also to ensure that they don't run away with the money. And so the way that they actually apply this is through milestone-based distribution. And so what that means is that when you're applying for your grant, in the application, you would indicate what your key milestones are and the date of delivery of those milestones. So if you are a grant reviewer, what you would do is you would review the update from the grantee, dependent on the platform, so forum, karma, or email, whatever, I don't know, depending on the communication that they require. And then once those milestones are done, then you can release the funds. And so there are like products like Hedgie Stream, and things like this that you can incorporate to just make it automatic. But what usually does happen is that you have a milestone reviewer to ensure that those have been done. And in some cases, like Optimism, for example, has an actual milestone and evaluation committee. And so their job is basically to ensure that the grantees that received any money are actually meeting their milestones. And then they would notify those who are responsible for distributing the funds. So that's actually what's happening right now, is that grant programs are wanting to ensure that the funds that they're distributing to grantees is actually going to the right places and meeting the objectives. And the way for you to do that is to create like a stagnant distribution of the money based on what they deliver. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, okay.
So you mentioned that usually when you're applying for grants, the entity offering the grant wants a return on their investment. That's what you said. So is that generally true for all of the grants that you've seen, or is there any sort of notion of like public goods funding as part of grants, or like what kind of returns do you think people want? Users, money, something like that?
So the return is based on the program objective. So the program usually has a goal. But why I'm saying a return of investment is that eventually, like in reality, of course, you can apply for a grant and then like it could have nothing. But like I want to give people advice on how to be sustainable in this industry, right? And so the only way really how you do that is to ensure that whatever money you're receiving is actually meeting the objective of them giving you that money, right? And so public good actually is aligned. So some examples could be Open Source Observer, which does like GitHub tracking for people's like projects and things like that, Karma Gap, HATS protocol, things like that, because those are tools that are solving problems, but are also open source. And of course, because they're open source projects, they don't necessarily have the same funds as large protocols. So they're always gonna apply for grants. And so this is how I would consider something more of a public good. Because I think there's the confusion with public good and charity, right? So public good is for something that is gonna add benefits to society. But the key thing is that you have to make it sustainable. Because if you don't, then we enter this thing, why I entered Web3, is to defeat the nonprofit industrial complex. So I think that the great thing about working on the internet is the power and agency that you have. And so I'm hoping that we kind of shift more into that so people build better projects for the future of the internet. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you. Hopefully this, oh, wait.
So, as Ethereum Mexico, we've been thinking about how we can become self-sustainable and how can we someday like stop asking for grants to survive and to continue with our operations. So my question is that if you saw or if you've seen like any communities that are trying to solve this and in which ways, like maybe in another part of the world, like some communities are doing something pretty cool to do that. So I want some ideas.
Yeah. So basically, long story is that how do you become more sustainable as Ethereum Mexico? So there are a couple of ways that I've actually seen events, even in the traditional world, actually work. So outside of just actual sponsorships, they also have like hackathons, and perspective of their winnings could go back to the event. There are also other things too, is that if people do support the Ethereum Mexico and the ethos of Ethereum Mexico, then they could also develop a membership. And because it's already a regional community, you have an opportunity to pair people with each other to build projects or to build in Web3. So like how I would actually see how to become more sustainable is developing the community outside of the event and doing things around it. So it could be ETH Mexico collabing with her DAO on a hackathon, or it could be ETH Mexico like memberships. And so I think that the way that you can look at an event, for example, outside of just being an event, is being like, how do I create this as a product? Kind of like a Techstars or a consensus mesh or things like this. And so the best models that I think that anybody really should look at, if there is none in Web3, is to look at like what happens in traditional kind of spaces when it comes to like Web2, right? So like what are Techstars, which is like a Web2 version of hackathons, doing? Like how do they grow? How do they raise funds? Because currently what I've seen in terms of events is that they do really rely on a lot of sponsorships or people paying for it. And a lot of them are nonprofits as well. So I think that they face the same kind of problems being a nonprofit, but it's like, how do you productize kind of that event to grow your community who's willing to pay for it?
I actually, to like chime in on that question too, I've noticed some interesting behavior from camps that go to Burning Man. Is they build these huge scenes and like bring crazy amounts of like sound equipment, and they do it for free. So that what they normally do, I found in these big camps, they also need to fundraise continually for the big event that happens every year, is they hold lots of smaller events. Like they'll have like a dance or a meal or something that happens throughout the year to fundraise for the big event that happens that like the whole community rallies around. So something else I found like in the Burning Man eco.
They're called regional burns too.
There's also regional burns, but they also do like specific camp events.
And is it fundraising that they do at the dinners? Sort of like, oh, if you enjoy this, chip in 20 USD. Yeah.
Pay the tickets, and they know it goes towards funding their main offering.
Nice.
You know, and community building. Yeah.
I mean, also like large fundraisers do the same thing. So like or galas. So before they have this large gala or raise for like a cause and things like that, they do small ones. So like sell cookies or bike rides or things like this. And so if you already have a regional community that's like really close, then people always want to do more things with each other. So that's kind of how I do it. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I hope this was really helpful.